that Harry was running out there in 2018. Bex and the family, including Victoria, all... She's got to take the monarchy onto the next stage. She's got to anticipate that there's a whole new 2 generations. He has made a fortune, and still does, from Spare and the Netflix series. Absolutely. And he says such terrible things about...
The truth didn't explode. It didn't scream. It crept in quietly. And that's exactly why it terrified everyone. Because when Tom Bower starts asking questions, history doesn't shrug them off. It freezes, rewinds, and replays every detail we thought we already knew. When Tom Bower starts making calls to journalists, people pay attention. And right now, he's talking about Lily Diana Mountbatten Windsor. But here's the thing, his version doesn't match the story. We've all been told the wildest part the palace hasn't responded, so what's really going on here? Hit subscribe and the notification bell right now, because this story is going to surprise you. Drop a like if you're curious to find out how everything unfolded behind the scenes. Bower's method is pretty straightforward. Random sources never happens. Preparation always involved. We're talking advanced copies with notes already marked up. Calls placed to senior editors before anything goes public. Full professional setup from start to finish. And that's where the panic begins, not with scandal, not with accusation, but with silence. Because when a man like Bower moves this carefully, this deliberately, it's never noise. It's a warning shot. This wasn't gossip tossed into the wind. This was choreography. Calls made before headlines existed. Editors quietly alerted. Timelines already cross-checked. This wasn't about creating chaos. It was about correcting a story that had already settled into public memory. And that distinction, that's lethal. Because corrections don't scream new scandal. They whisper something doesn't line up. And whispers linger longer than screams.
The whole description she does of the Portland hospital, the birth, that was completely fabricated.
And that reputation matters. Years spent building credibility, sourcing within institutions, triangulating accounts, persisting when others step back means people listen differently. This wasn't some anonymous tip floating around Twitter or a tabloid trying to move papers. This was Tom Bower, and anyone familiar with his work understands what that means. He doesn't tackle subjects to speculate, he tackles them to reframe what's been publicly understood. According to journalists at the early briefings, Bower wasn't coming in with a single bombshell. He was presenting what he called a correction. And correction is a dangerous word because it implies the original story wasn't false, just unfinished, slightly off, softened, shifted over time until nobody noticed the gap anymore. Bower didn't say, here's a lie. He said, let's look again. And that's worse because once you reopen something everyone assumed was settled, you don't need accusations, you just need receipts.
Happy family. I think they have to appeal to the youth of Britain, who are not natural monarchists.
Bower was questioning what we already know. Think about that for a second. He wasn't claiming, look at this crazy thing that just happened. He was stating, hey, let's examine something we all thought we understood. Our focus was on how Lilibet was described from the beginning, the timing of announcements, the details shared with the media, who actually made statements and their exact words. And suddenly, the ground shifted. Not motive, not intent, not feelings, process, dates, attribution, language, sequence, the boring stuff, the deadly stuff. Because process is where stories crack. Royal editors leaned in, not because they smelled drama, but because they smelled structure. And structure doesn't lie easily.
Were tightly staged. This wasn't proof, but it was pattern, and pattern is where belief starts to harden.
Then when he surfaces with something, there's usually receipts attached. He referenced interviews, timelines, clarifications that never reached the mainstream conversation. The effect was subtle but destabilizing. That's the word everyone kept using behind closed doors. Destabilizing, not explosive, not outrageous. Unsettling. For years, royal children existed behind an invisible shield. But this wasn't about a child. This was about adults and the stories they told. And the palace, completely silent.
Actress. You raise this extraordinary beginning of the year when she carved 2025.
Not emotion or intent anymore, not whether someone meant well or had good reasons. The focus becomes whether things match up. And once that gets raised, especially by someone with Bower's track record, things don't just disappear. They linger. Inside Buckingham, things cracked fast. 2 camps, both panicking, for opposite reasons. One side begged for silence, don't touch it. A child is involved. Any response looks invasive. The other side whispered something far scarier. If we say nothing, people will assume he's right. Because silence silence doesn't stay neutral when evidence is calmly laid out. Silence becomes an answer. And then came the most uncomfortable realization of all. The palace hadn't written Meghan's version of events. So were they even responsible for defending it? That question split the room. Because royal narratives don't need signatures to be institutional. They just need proximity. And once Bauer's version entered the bloodstream, the palace faced an impossible choice: respond and set a precedent they'd never escape, or stay quiet and let a new version harden into history. They chose silence, and that decision pushed the spotlight somewhere unexpected, straight onto Meghan. Her power has always been narrative control, precision, curation, owning the story before anyone else can. But this time, someone else was holding the pen. And worse, he wasn't emotional, he wasn't angry, he wasn't accusing, he was calm. That's what made this unbearable. Because you can fight outrage, you can rebut bias, but how do you fight a spreadsheet? Media panels shifted tone overnight. Sympathy gave way to scrutiny. Feelings gave way to verification. And then something even more unsettling happened. Harry disappeared. No statements, no context, no reframing, no gentle humanizing, just silence. And silence, when it breaks pattern, speaks loudly. People noticed. Analysts noticed. Commentators noticed. This was supposed to be us against the world. Now it looked like her against the question mark. Day after day, nothing from the palace. No background briefings, no quiet nudges, no friendly corrections. And that absence changed everything. Because when history is being rewritten and no one objects, the rewrite sticks. This wasn't trending chaos. This was archival damage. And that's the kind that doesn't fade. And here's the part nobody wanted to say out loud. Once the palace stayed silent, the story stopped being about what happened and started being about what would be remembered. Because public memory doesn't care about intentions, it cares about what's written down. What started as a correction quietly transformed into a reference point, not a rumor, not a theory, a footnote that refuses to disappear. Commentators stopped asking, is this true? And started asking, why hasn't this been addressed? And that shift is everything. Meghan felt the weight of that shift immediately. This wasn't a scandal she could reframe with emotion or personal testimony. There was no villain to call out, no attack to defend against, just a man calmly laying out timelines while institutions that usually intervene didn't. That's exposure of the coldest kind. And time was not on her side. Every hour without a response gave Bauer's version more oxygen. More outlets mentioned it casually. More analysts treated it as context instead of controversy. It slipped into the background of royal coverage, and that's where narratives become permanent. Background stories don't fade, they settle. The palace told itself they were avoiding a bigger disaster, that responding would open floodgates, that once you correct one author, every author lines up for correction. That silence now was cheaper than precedent forever. But that calculation came at a cost, and that cost landed squarely on Meghan, because without institutional balance, her story had to stand alone against documentation. And documentation always looks heavier. Supporters rallied fast. They argued lived experience matters more than paperwork. That motherhood isn't measured in timestamps. That love doesn't come with forms attached. That focusing on details misses the human truth entirely. And emotionally, they weren't wrong. But public record doesn't operate on emotion, it operates on verification. Critics weren't accusing wrongdoing, and that's what made this so dangerous. They were simply saying the story, as told, wasn't complete. And incompleteness invites curiosity. Curiosity invites digging. Digging invites permanence. Harry's silence made it worse, because historically he steps in, he contextualizes, he humanizes, he bridges the gap between public skepticism and private reality. This time, nothing. That absence shifted perception whether it was fair or not. It made it look like this was Meghan's narrative to defend alone. And once that image takes hold, it's nearly impossible to reverse. Some whispered that he'd been advised not to engage. Others suggested he didn't know how. A few quietly wondered if he couldn't confirm details himself. Nobody knows which explanation is true. What's clear is this: the unified front fractured at the exact moment unity mattered most. Media coverage evolved again. It wasn't Tom Bauer claims, it became Tom Bauer claims, and no one is disputing it. That second clause carries weight, and weight accumulates. Royal watchers began talking about historical memory, the long game. They warned that interviews fade, emotions cool, and public arguments end. But what's written? That stays. Every future biography, every timeline, every documentary looking back at the Sussex years will include this moment, not as scandal, but as added context, as the moment questions appeared. And unanswered questions don't vanish. they echo. For Meghan, this marked a rare loss of narrative control, not through explosive revelation, but through methodical doubt, a calm paper trail challenge that couldn't be shouted down or emotionally reframed. That kind of challenge demands institutional backing, and she didn't get it. The palace protected its process, not its people. That realization hit hard, not just for Meghan, but for Harry too. It clarified something brutal. Leaving royal work also meant leaving royal cover. When scrutiny comes, you're on your own. And once that truth sinks in, everything changes. What you share, how you share, whether you speak at all. The understanding around Lilibet shifted, not dramatically, not explosively, but subtly, permanently. There's now an asterisk where certainty used to live. Not because lies were proven, not because secrets exploded, but because someone credible asked questions and no one credible answered. That's all it takes. In the end, this wasn't about a baby. It wasn't about malice. It wasn't even about blame. It was about memory, about which version survives when the noise dies down. And right now, the version with documentation is the one being archived. That's the real shock. That's the real shock. That's the real shock.